Okay.
Isn't evolution just a theory?
It is a common misconception among non-scientists that evolution is just a theory. I think that comes from them thinking that a theory is sort of a careless idea that really doesn't have a lot of evidence. It's probably wrong anyway.
In everyday language, a theory is basically a hunch or a guess, but in science it is not. Theories are the heart of science. They pull together observations, laws, hypotheses, and inferences into coherent explanations for the great mysteries of the universe. In the 1800s, Charles Darwin observed the enormous diversity of life on Earth and set out to explain it. From the evidence he collected, Darwin developed his theory of evolution by natural selection, a theory that explains how new species originate.
The globe has undergone such profound changes in its history. Geologically, surely all living creatures must have changed with it to adapt to their new conditions. Well, otherwise they would have perished.
What theory does is it draws these ideas together, it draws observations together, and makes sense of them to allow you to make expectations. That's what theory is. And then we go and test those expectations.
People used to believe that the sun revolved around the Earth because that's how it looked. Over time, the steady accumulation of evidence supported a different theory, that the Earth and other planets revolve around the sun. And what about gravity? Have you ever said, oh, gravity is just a theory. I don't believe in it.
A lot of people seem to think that you need to be able to see something directly in order to accept it as a good scientific idea. But in reality, all you're seeing when you see a book falling are the effects of gravity. You're not really seeing gravity itself. Gravity is something, in terms of gravitation theory, something that we have yet to fully explain.
Even so, we still rely on theories to make predictions that help us conduct our lives, to travel, to heal the sick, and to explore the universe.
Apollo 11, this is Houston, over.
Before anyone had ever traveled to the moon, NASA scientists applied gravitation theory to predict what it would be like to move in the lunar environment. Predictions like these are called inferences. An inference is a conclusion you can draw from the available evidence. If I place this cube on the table, and you have the 5 and the 1 and the 3 and the 6 and the 4, what would you say is on the bottom? Again, you have the 5 and the 1 and the 3 and the 6 and the 4. One can infer by looking at the data that's the observable data that number 2 would be at the bottom. Charles Darwin inferred from the evidence available to him that all living creatures, including humans, descended from a common ancestor.
I think it's like a tree. A tree of life. Each new species is a new shoot that springs from the parent tree. These new shoots branch out and develop in their turn and so on. Some branches die out, others keep developing. The trunk, the ancient common ancestor.
Today, scientists continue to find evidence that supports Darwin's common ancestor inference in the fossil record and in genes. With new discoveries, details of scientific theory are refined. and scientists are comfortable with the notion that theories are constantly challenged and amended. That's the nature of science. If apples suddenly start rising, you can be sure that some aspect of gravitation theory will change. But science will not reject the very idea that there is a force called gravity. New discoveries may also refine elements of the theory of evolution by natural selection. But the notion that the Earth and its inhabitants have evolved from a common ancestor will not change.
I don't think any person with even a small amount of scientific background would reject cell theory or atomic theory or germ theory that pathogens cause disease just because we think of those ideas as theories.
The theory of evolution is no different. Like other scientific theories, evolution also helps us make sense of the natural world in which we live.
Okay. All right, I just want to give that introduction. You should have sort of known that and flash learning that last year in the where you get that one. But in terms of evolution, we have something called natural selection. It's so highly supported by evidence. It's it's theory. It's on the same lines as gravitational theory. Like, anyway, hopefully you're beyond that. But anyway, so let's kind of move on. So long ago, Western culture sort of resisted the idea that things evolved or changed through time. And so this is a painting by that guy. I don't know how to pronounce that, but it's called The Creation of Animals. It was created in 1550. And a lot of times, in Greek philosophy and things like that, everybody opposed any idea of evolution. And it's because of the Bible, really, and what was written. And, God created the earth and blah, 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 however put up. And I'm not, no one's saying that's wrong. But when we talk about this kind of stuff, there is, what we discuss in science is what we can test, testable ideas. Okay, so there's a difference between faith and from science, right? Faith is something you just believe because you believe it. You can't test, like, is there a God? Like, there's no yes or no answer. There's you believe it or you don't. Like, it is what it is, and you can't do some sort of science experiment to prove it, right? You know what I'm saying? So that's faith, and that's over there. I'm not saying it's wrong. We just can't do anything with it in science because there's no way to test it. You just believe that's what it is. And so, and the idea of evolution and change over time doesn't necessarily have to go in opposition to someone's faith. And if you're ever interested in that stuff, talk to people at your church or whatever. I can even talk to you after class. But because I go to church, but they don't have to work in opposition. But anyway, for a long time, this is what people thought, and that was okay. They had no anything to prove otherwise, really. So that's that. They thought that species were perfect the way that they were created, quote unquote, and they did not change over time. And if you actually look at evidence through time, you find that species do change over time, and species go extinct, and new species arise. And so you start to wonder, well, how is that possible? And so anyway. So doctrine is something that you just sort of believe without questioning, right? Right. So there's a lot of evidence to suggest otherwise, and the fossil record is one piece of evidence that we utilize. There's actually lots, and we'll talk about those in a little while. But scientists, and Darwin in particular, started making observations and noticed that things do change over time, and he noticed that change or species change depending on where you go in the world, and he started to ask why and wondered why that is. And anyway, this is the wrong PowerPoint. Hold on. So there's a guy named Charles Lamarck who was a French scientist, and shoot, this is the wrong PowerPoint. I'm sorry, hold on. But what did he think? Y'all remember? Yeah. Acquired traits were inherited. And do you remember I talked about how that's not so maybe laughable anymore? Yep. I mean, it's not what he was thinking of, but where is this? Yeah. Yes. Okay. This is the more recent one. Sorry. I'm in the wrong spot. Well, let's just talk about Darwin. Okay, Darwin was a scientist that lived, Charles Darwin, 1800s. He was a British quote-unquote naturalist. He's the one that proposed the idea of evolution via a process called natural selection, we'll talk about, and he had a lot of evidence to support his ideas. Let me talk a little bit, just because I think it's interesting about his history. He grew up in a family. His father was, I think, a clergyman, and at the time in the culture, in British culture, it was sort of the most respected jobs were to be in the clergy or to be like a doctor. And so Darwin, when he was growing up, he was really interested, like he would go outside and collect rocks and stuff. Like he was really into nature and that kind of stuff. But because of sort of societal pressure and family pressure, he went to school to become a doctor. And he decided really that this wasn't for him. And so then he changed and went to school to become a man of the clergy. And so that's what he did. And the whole while he was in school, he still was an avid naturalist, would observe nature, collect specimens, look at stuff. He had copious journals and notes and all kinds of things. So he sort of kept that interest side of up. But he also became a clergyman, like I said, a person of the church. And when the at some point, this captain, Robert Fitzroy, was charged to take a voyage around the world. And when he was trying to establish sort of a crew of people to go on this boat with him, he needed to find someone that was like a clergyman to serve as a person that people on the boat could go and talk to if they had issues or whatever. And so he somehow found about Darwin and wrote him a letter basically asking him to go on this voyage with him. And Darwin, when he got that letter, he was really excited about it. Because, oh my gosh, I mean, he got to see the world. And you know, if you can imagine, like you get on your TV and see pictures, and get on the internet and see pictures of, South America. That didn't happen at the time. There were no pictures of South America people could look at. They didn't even know where South America was. Like, no idea. So the idea of getting on a boat and seeing new worlds that no one's ever seen before was like, I mean, it's like you traveling to Mars or something. And even at this point, we've seen pictures of Mars, sort of. So I don't know. I just can't even imagine the excitement and the fear and all that he probably felt. He was only 22 years old, but he decided to go. Why not? And during this voyage lasted 5 years. 5 years on a boat and some on land. That's a long time to be gone. And he was actually really seasick, and so was Robert Fitzroy. So as soon as whenever they got to land, and you can see this is the voyage they took. Whenever they got to land, he would immediately get off the boat. Because it was the point you get off the boat, you don't feel so bad anymore. And he would start taking notes and observations. And oh my gosh, imagine South America and the difference between that and where he came from in England. Like hugely different. Like rainforests, and you could see mountains, you could see all this stuff that he'd never ever seen before. So it was like, holy cow. And on this voyage, he saw earthquakes, he saw all kinds of different things happening, and he noticed organisms and species he'd never seen before, and he collected specimens all over the place. You think of Darwin, you might think of the Galapagos Islands, but he collected a lot of evidence from a lot of other places as well, not just the Galapagos. So you notice they went all around South America, the Galapagos here. They came around, went to Australia, the tip of South Africa, back over to South America, and then up back to England. So anyways, that is the voyage of the ship, the HMS Beagle, that he took. And like I said, he got lots and lots and lots of evidence and took note after note after note in these journals all along the way. He also took with him a lot of other readings, scientists of the time. So I'm going to kind of go back. Oh, wait, that's not on this one. Hold on, I'll come back. Hold on. That's a picture. Oh, shoot, I don't. There were a lot of other people at the time that had published things and had journals and writings that he read along the way. You learned about Thomas Malthus maybe in AP Human Geography? Yeah, who's taking that? Is he? No, okay, well. He talked a lot about populations and population growth, and as populations get too sizable, then there's going to be a competition because of the limited resources, and he was talking about human populations. So Darwin read on that and sort of started thinking about that in terms of other organisms, not just humans. Lamarck was a little bit before his time. We'll talk about Lamarck in a little bit. But anyway, so he was not only, taking his own journal notes and collecting evidence, but he was also reading a lot of other stuff at the time. And 5 years on a boat, y'all, with no TV, no phone, no radio, like none of that existed, you have a lot of time to do a lot of thinking. A lot of thinking. Okay, so that's what he did. So he noticed a lot of things. One of the things he noticed were armadillos. I can't imagine seeing a real one. They're actually kind of cute. But he noticed armadillos, and they're actually native to the Americas, and most of them are found in South America. And there's different types of armadillos, 3-banded and then 6-banded, the number of bands you see on their little outer part. And they're tiny. Look at this little guy. That's when they close up. So cute. And there's also something known as Glyptodont fossil. They're a lot larger, but that's the sort of their relatives in terms of evolutionary, ancient relatives. These fossils are unique to South America. And so Darwin found these fossils, but also found the current armadillos. And so he asked the question, why should extinct armadillo-like species and living armadillos be found on the same continent? If organisms were created perfect and created the same and they didn't change over time, well, what happened? So he started asking these questions. He would see this stuff and wonder what happened. And they look like the same, but they're not, and what happened? That's not obviously real. It's a cartoon.
There's the armadillo from was it El Dorado?
Is that what it is?
No, that one's from Iceland, but there's a smaller one. That's from the Meltdown.
Oh, okay. I haven't seen that one. So a Mylodon is a giant sloth. Modern sloths are much smaller than that, but that's probably what it looks like. It's huge. Modern sloths are tiny. It's hard to see here. It's got little babies right there for sheep. Anyways, they're nocturnal organisms, so they really are at night. But this is a quote from one of his books. The wonderful relationship in the same continents between the dead and the living will throw more light on the appearance of organic beings on our Earth and their disappearance, blah, blah, blah. Okay. So his book I've read, it's called On the Origin of Species. It's really written in like older English. It's kind of hard to read, but it's actually very interesting to read. Anyways, he also noticed on the Galapagos Islands in particular, a lot of what we call endemic species that are very unique that you will not find anywhere else on the Earth. So he noticed the giant tortoises, the Komodo dragons, and the blue-footed boobies, or what those birds are called. We'll talk more about blue-footed boobies when we talk about sexual selection in a little while. And he noticed the Galapagos finches, and you might have heard about them in Bio 1, the finches? Yeah. Okay. So he noticed these only there, and nowhere else that he went, and you wondered why. And on the Galapagos Islands in particular, it's an archipelago, so a number of different islands. They're volcanic type islands. And he noticed a bunch of different species of finch, like a lot of different species. And he collected all these different birds, and at first he thought they were actually not closely related at all. And he thought some were finches, some were sparrows, some were woodpeckers, some were warblers. He found them located foraging. Foraging is a word for what organisms do when they find food. It's called forage. So he found them foraging in different parts of the different islands, some on the ground, some in the trees. Some would eat insects, some would eat fruits, some would eat nuts, they would eat different things. So he didn't think they were actually close related, but he found that they were actually all 14 different species of a finch. So there's a large ground finch, a small ground finch, a warbler finch, tree finch, and there were a lot. But there was only one species of finch he found on all his, and he went to a lot of different places on South America. And he wondered, well, how in the world? Why are there 14 species on these islands, but only one on the giant landmass that is South America?
Like, how did he just
When he he killed some of them and took them back, and he did a lot of anatomical studying and found that they were basically all. So what happened? Okay, so he asked the question, what happened? So he started thinking, and this is a sketch from one of his notebooks. This is sort of a phylogenetic type tree, okay, showing that they were all related to this common ancestor, and at some point they started to branch off. Okay, and what causes the branching? And what do you think now that what do you think? Why did they all eventually branch off? What makes them different? Their environment and what they're all eating something different. Okay, we talked about the word niche earlier. No two organisms can occupy the same niche, so they all evolved to occupy different niches on those islands. So here are all the different species of finches, and actually they are. So here's this common ancestor from South America, the mainland, and probably what happened is a lot of them, or a number of them, migrated to the Galapagos Islands. And over time, a long time, they started to evolve to forage different food sources, live in different areas, and eat different food sources, and they form different species. Now, in the next chapter, we're going to talk about, well, what makes one species of finch different from another one. The definition of species is an organism that can reproduce and produce viable offspring with another. And so, horses and mules can reproduce, but they produce something that's sterile. So they remain separate species, even though they can produce a very strong offspring. The offspring cannot produce gametes, so it's not its own species. So these organisms, because they live in different areas and they eat different foods, and over evolutionary time, and this, thousands upon thousands of years, a long time, they now probably will never come into contact with each other. If they do, they have different mating behaviors, they have different mating rituals, and they actually won't reproduce, or if they do, they won't produce a viable offspring. Anyways, notice they also have very different beak sizes. It's because they're eating different types of food. So we're our seed eaters. So medium-sized beak, really small beak, really big beak. These guys probably really small seeds, medium seeds, really big seeds. And over time, because So these eat buds, so flower buds. Anyway. There we go. So it's called adaptive radiation. It's where you have an ancestral species coming from a mainland that travels to, it's usually you see it on island nations, and you'll see that organisms, species will evolve to many different species in a relatively short amount of evolutionary time. It's called adaptive radiation. There are literally hundreds of species of fruit fly on the Hawaiian Islands, and there's not that many found wherever it's closest, and it's because of the adaptive radiation. There's so many different types of fruit found in Hawaii that they've all sort of evolved to forage on different ones. Okay. Adaptive radiation, like I said, is relatively rapid, and the term rapid in terms of evolutionary time is actually not long. You know how old the planet is? Over 4 billion years old, the planet, y'all. Okay, when I say the word billion, it's really hard to even comprehend what that means. I'm 37, I'm old. It's hard to imagine living to be 100 years, and then to think that, this year is, 2016? It's hard to imagine 2000. It's hard to imagine when this country was founded a couple hundred years ago versus 2,000 years versus 4 billion. You can't even imagine. It's so long ago, you can't even imagine. So evolutionary time is so long that rapid means 100,000 years versus 2 million years. You can't even imagine that. So rapid, 100,000 is really fast compared to 1 million, but it's really not that long, okay? So anyway, the term rapid, you should take that in terms of evolutionary time, okay? Still a long time. And you have to think about, we'll talk more about it later. Anyways, and the adaptive radiation happens when you have new species come in, like I said, they fill new niches. So they occupy different environments, eat different foods, have different roles. So now that what happened is this first species, well, how in the world can you have this much variation from just one species? Well, remember, in every species, everything is genetically variant. We have different color hair, we have different heights, we have different, nose lengths, we have different everything in our own species. So in this little, however many came from the mainland, there had to be genetic variation already present in those birds. And the ones that could survive because they were able to break open a certain seed, maybe they had a naturally bigger beak and they were able to get these really large seeds, okay? Then they started to survive. Whereas the other ones, maybe if they couldn't break open the big seed, they would die off. And over time, long time, you have these variants that are already present in this population really start to come out. And eventually they would evolve to their own species. Does that make sense? Okay.
So it's like a, there's one, let's put the common answer, whatever, they're like small beak, and there are variants where one has a little bit smaller beak and one has a large beak, and then as the larger beak survives, and they have variants with even larger beak.
Yes.
And then, okay.
Yes. Yeah.
So it's just kind of what it was wrong.
Basically. Yeah, and it takes a long time. They've done a lot of, scientists have done a lot of research in recent years, like 50 years or so, on the Galapagos Islands with the finches. And there's some data that I think I looked at and actually wrote a lab for like a bio one on top of USC. I have it up there the other day. But based on some data on beak length in just over like 20 years. And it showed that the finches on the Galapagos Islands, and during this time frame that I used data from, there was like a time period where there's a lot of rain and the time period of like a drought. And the seeds that were produced during those two times were very different. And you could actually see the change in the beak sizes of the finches just during those time periods, or like afterwards. Because during a lot of rain, there were all these certain seeds that were made, but then the drought happened, a lot of the seeds weren't produced, and the birds, there were only maybe like big seeds. And then all the ones with the smaller beaks like couldn't survive and they died off. And the ones that reproduced after that were the ones with the bigger beaks. So the beak size actually changed in just a relatively short amount of time. So, okay. So that's basically everything I just said. So the natural variation is already present, enabled the individuals to gather food successfully and therefore survive, to reproduce, to pass on their successful traits. Over time, you have the accumulation of these advantageous traits, okay? And that allowed, over time, speciation to occur. So is there, and we'll talk about this again at the end, but is there, do you think, like a perfect species, quote unquote? Or a species that is perfectly adapted to the environment? Probably not. And there is no perfect species because a species is adapted to its current environment. Well, what if that environment changes? They're probably not going to be so adapted anymore. You might see a lot of them die off. So natural selection works on making a population adapted to its current environment. The natural selection forces, and we'll talk about those later, will change as the environment changes. So this is like another quote from his book. I'm just going to let you read it, reading it loud. Okay. We already talked about it. All right, you can see also in this, the archipelago, the Galapagos, the tortoises. So on the different islands, so here it says Isabella, the largest island. There, this little guy has a really short neck. The guy on the Pinta Island has a medium-sized neck, and the one on the Hood Island is a really long neck. What do you think their neck sizes are correlated with? Their food sources. On the Isabella Island, where you find this tortoise, the food source is like right there at the ground. versus on the Pinta Island, it's a little bit higher up on a bush, and on the Hood Island, it's much higher up. So imagine if you put this guy, the tiny neck on this island, they're probably gonna die out. Because they can't reach the food, I mean, he's got no neck, so they won't eat and then they'll die. So anyways, you can see that also on these islands, it's the different tortoises. Oh my gosh, y'all, did I tell you the time we went to the zoo and the tortoises were like mating? And Little Flash and Mary Frances was like, oh, they're playing. They're like, yeah, they are. Oh.
I went to the zoo a couple weeks ago and the tortoises have like a fight, but it's kind of anticlimactic. Like it took them like 2 minutes to actually walk together and meet them. They like hit each other a couple times and they walked away.
Oh no, they're so slow.
Yeah, I don't blame them for being angry.
That's really
Well, they were like angry with each other.
Yeah, 'cause they probably were
When they
dangerous
used
to
to
them.
have that polar bear, my dad would always say that polar bear was so sad because he was walking
Such a
so
small.
hot.
They used to have like a viewing area underneath the ground where you could look at the glass up in the pool. It's been closed off for like many years. But when the polar bear would swim in the water, you could go like and see it swimming. Anyway. Okay. On the Isabella Island, there's the tortoises that actually live there. Their shells actually look really different depending where they live on there. It's interesting. They're still the same species, but. All right. Artificial selection I'll just talk about, but a lot of the things that we eat today, cauliflower, broccoli, cabbage, kale, kohlrabi, I've never actually eaten that, is all related to and descended from the wild mustard plant. It's called artificial selection. And actually, they're all derived from different parts of the plant, like flower buds or axillary buds, or here we have, this says, what does that say? Sterility of flowers, this is suppression of flower development, intermediate node, or internode length. The node is the region between, like where the buds come off. Enlargement of leaves make the kale and the kohlrabi. Have you ever had kohlrabi? I think it's a Japanese, I don't know what it is. Anyways, lateral meristem. So anyways, artificial selection is human caused selection. And now we have all the foods that we eat. Brussels sprouts are on there too. Anyway. And we use artificial selection today. What's cool is that Darwin, now we didn't really talk about this stuff, but he talked about this in his book. One of the things he did in his Origin of Species, and I'll talk about it a little bit, but this was so complicated and also so like not what people thought. It was so against doctrine. He was really nervous to publish his work, and I'll talk more about that in a minute. But one of the things he tried to do was make it relatable to his audience. So at the time, I don't know why, but pigeon breeding was like super popular. Who knows why, but it really was. And so he talked a lot about, related some of the examples he found in his book to like the pigeon breeding. Anyway, so from this normally boring pigeon, you can get all these different variants depending on how you breed them. It's the same thing with dog breeds, right? They're all the same species. They're just bred for a different reason, and you produce all the different breeds we have now. Anyways, that's crazy, but there you go. Same thing here. Yeah. Okay, but artificial selection is sort of human caused. It's interesting, dogs are all descended from the wild wolf, and you think about like at the time when humans were sort of more nomadic type people, why do you think wolves would be attracted to them?
We have a sort of pack structure today, we have like a leader of the group.
Yeah,
But they leave stuff behind when they were like going places and they.
Yeah, that probably, yes, more like that. Like humans would be killing things to eat it. And then the wolves would come and be like, I want to eat that too, right? Okay, so now some wolves will probably, attack the humans, but the wolves that didn't, maybe started to live with the humans because the wolves would maybe provide protection to the humans would give them food. Does that make sense? So over time, they became domesticated. And that's how we have the domestic dogs that we have now. And people would, be like, that was a really good swimmer. We're going to keep that one. And every time it produced breeds that are like really good swimming or really good at hunting, like if you, shoot doves or something, you have certain dogs that will go like find it for you or whatever. Anyway, I don't know much about hunting, but All right, so here's some other scientists along the way that Darwin came before Darwin and sort of at the same time as Darwin. So Linnaeus, Carlos Linnaeus, I've talked about before. He's, maybe you haven't, binomial nomenclature. Okay, he's the one that came up with that. So taxonomy, we'll talk about another chapter. Hutton, Charles Hutton was the same guy that sort of, this was some readings that Darwin read about, but he had this idea of gradualism, that he was more of a geologist, okay? Earth processes like earthquakes and stuff like that happen very slowly, like geologic changes generally happen slowly over time. They're gradual, obviously maybe not earthquakes, but other changes slowly over time. But in things like the formation of the Grand Canyon, like that just didn't happen like that. It formed slowly over geologic time. That was gradualism in Hutton. Lamarck was the idea, he was the acquired trait, so if you cut off your arm, then your offspring are going to have an arm. Like, I don't know about that, not so much. Now we did, the whole idea of epigenetics. But Thomas Malthus is the person that looked at populations, human population. Darwin read that, and a lot of his writings influenced his idea on natural selection. Cuvier was a paleontologist, and he kind of wrote same lines as Hutton, a little bit different. Lyell, Charles Lyell was a little bit before Darwin, and uniformitarianism, these geologic processes are common. They're uniform throughout the planet. Same kind of thing, a little bit more. So here we have Darwin. Notice Mendel is on here. Mendel had no idea about Darwin. Darwin had no idea about Mendel. They kind of didn't know each other existed, but it's just kind of interesting they lived at the same time. And then we'll talk about Thomas Wallace in a little bit. So, you can see down here, blah, 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 blah. Okay. We talked about, okay, so Thomas Malthus talked about the competition struggle for survival. He's talking about humans, but Darwin used that as, apply to his ideas. Charles Lyell was the person talking about geology. Land masses change over a measurable time, kind of going off of Hutton's ideas. So, now here's Lamarck. So he said that they change over time, so disuse. So an example of like a fish that lives in a cave fish, they don't have eyes, all right? So according to Lamarck, they would just lose their ability because they didn't see anymore. They didn't need them. So disuse, their offspring just wouldn't have them because they don't need them. That's not actually what happened, okay? So when a stream cuts through a mountain and you have now, stream in caves, the fish that swim in there will maybe be like, whoa, there's no competition, there's a lot of food in here, we're gonna hang out in here. But if they had a mutation in their DNA that allowed them not to see, did it matter? There's no light in the mountain anyway. It didn't matter to them, okay? So over many, 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 many generations, if they could accumulate mutations in the genes that code for their vision, it didn't matter because they weren't using their eyes anyway. Does that make sense? And so now the modern cave fish have eyes, they have vestigial eyes. They have eyes that are there, but they don't actually work. They don't need them to work. But the reason they're there is because their ancestors had functional eyes. Make sense?
It's like sensory, like, how do they sense if food's here?
Oh, no. A lot of chemicals. Yeah.
How do they like not run the
They probably do, but I don't know. And then he thought of this perfection with use and need. So a night flying bat has really big ears because it helps them to hear because they can't rely so much on their sense of sight. And so over time, they probably got bigger ears to help them survive and hear their predators. And anyway, but according to Lamarck, that would happen in just one generation. And we know that's not exactly true the way he talked about it, although epigenetics. All right, and the giraffe thing, we talked about it before. So they didn't just stretch their necks in one generation, right? If they didn't get the food, they would just die. Okay. All right, so here we have this little guy trying to fight off like competitors or something. He grew a really big claw and killed him or ate him or something, and now the offspring have big claws like that. All right, and then Hutton, like I said, he was a little bit longer ago, but these, Earth changes. I already sort of talked about him. Don't worry about Lyell. We already talked about him. Malthus, I already mentioned him. All right, so he came back in 1836 after 5 years on a boat. He had all his journals, everything. He took a long time to write all about his stuff. But he was really nervous, like really nervous. He was scared to death to publish anything because he knew that at the time everybody was going to laugh at him and call him an atheist or whatever. And so then he distracted himself by writing this really long, basically, article on barnacles, just because he just didn't want to talk about his evolution things. He studied barnacles and wrote a really long essay on them. And he finally finished his draft of the theories of species formation in 1844, 8 years after he came back. He was still really nervous, so he didn't want to publish it, but he told his wife, like, hey, if I die, go ahead and publish this. But he didn't want to do it while he was living. He was scared of the lashback from society at the time. But he didn't want his ideas to die with him, so he told her to do it, if he dies. But then something happened. In 1858, so at this point, 14 years after this, he got a letter that changed his thinking on all this. Now, at this time, he hadn't published anything. But he got this letter from a man named Alfred Russel Wallace. Or no, he didn't get a letter. Yeah, he did. And this guy was younger than Darwin, and he had actually been working in the East Indies. The East Indies were sort of like an archipelago, much the same as Darwin saw in the Galapagos. And any archipelago you go to, you're going to make the same kind of observations. Why are there so many species of this here, but there's not on the mainland? So Wallace started noticing a lot of the same things Darwin did. Now, no, Darwin had not published anything. The only person who knew about this stuff was his wife, so Wallace didn't know about it. But Wallace wrote his ideas down in the form of like a short paper. He sent it to Darwin to look at, and he's like, what do you think about this? And Darwin was like, basically like, no more cuts. He was like, oh crap. Because this is everything Darwin had said 14 years ago, and even more than that. And he wrote this really long book on it, but he never published it because he was scared to. So then Wallace was like, hey, this is what I think, and a really short and sweet thing. And, he wanted to publish it. And Darwin was like, great. And so Lyell, he wrote a letter to Lyell, who's a friend of his, and said, and Lyell, along the way, had encouraged him to publish, and he just didn't want to do it. So then he wrote to Lyell, your words have come true with a vengeance. I never saw a more striking coincidence. All of my originality, whatever it may amount to, will be smashed. Basically saying, like, I came up with this first, but this dude's trying to say it, and then basically I'm going to get not credited for it. And so what happened was that they both presented their papers at a conference. Well, Darwin had an entire book, and then Wallace had just like a short journal article. So they both presented them at the same sort of convention. But the reason why Darwin is really credited for all this is, one, because his book is like a book. So Matt, I don't think this is another one I think I learned to someone that never get back to me. I don't have it anymore. But he's got an entire book on the origin of species about all his evidence, everything, and he never gets back. Anyway, and then Wallace just basically had a 2-page paper. So Darwin is credited for this, but just know, he wasn't the only one that thought about this. Anyway, so this is the book that was published on November 24th, 1859, On the Origin of Species by Natural Selection. Like I said, if you ever want to read it, it's interesting. It's really hard to read, but so that's that. I kind of like the history of all this just because it's interesting to me, but what you really need to know is what I'm getting ready to say. So, what is natural selection? And it's based on the idea that natural variation exists in all species, in all populations. Genetic variation, it's just there already. Also, all populations have a tendency to overproduce, produce too many offspring, or produce a lot of offspring. So much more that the environment actually can't support all of them. So because there's too many offspring, too many organisms that the environment can't replace, there's going to be competition for resources. It'll be competition for food, competition for water, competition for mates. Against predators, competition in general. And if there's competition, there's going to be winners and there's going to be losers. Okay? So there's going to be something called differential survival. The ones that survive are the ones that are going to be better suited in that particular environment to get food, to get mates, to get water, to get a nesting site, for example, to get fight off disease, get away from predators, whatever. The ones that survive will pass on their successful genes, and over time, the population will become more adapted to its current environment. So that's 5 different things on there. You have to know all 5 of them. You see that? Variation exists, overproduction of offspring, competition for survival, differential survival, differential reproduction, blah, blah, blah. You have to know all that. Mm-hmm. Yep. Do you remember this from Bio 1?
Yeah.
Okay, good. And so, like I said, over time, natural selection will result in populations that are better adapted to their current environment. Okay? When we talk about a species fitness, so I'm not talking about how strong somebody is, I'm talking about their reproductive fitness. Okay, how successful they are reproducing and passing on their genes. So when we talk in terms of evolution of fitness, it means ability to reproduce and pass on genes. Okay, so what do you think is going to happen to that beetle population?
The green ones, the orange ones are gonna reproduce at a more rapid rate.
Yeah. You'll probably see more orange ones eventually. Because those green ones are going to be eaten. There is something called the Darwin Awards. Have you all heard of them? Stephen Andreen found this the other day. This is an old one, but he kept this place in the every year somebody comes out with the Darwin Awards. You don't want to get one of these because either that means you're dead or you're like super injured, okay? But the Darwin Awards are when people do something really stupid and they end up dying from it, and therefore they're selected again. Let's see. Let me find one. A short one. These are old. Here's one. The 1994 Darwin Award went to the fellow who was killed by a Coke machine, which toppled over on top of him as he was attempting to tip a free soda out of it. So anyway, there were some people that won a Darwin Award in from Colombia. It was a while ago, like maybe 10 years ago now. There were 2 college students, and they were having relations on the top of a building downtown, and they rolled off and died. I remember after that happened, I went to JSHS, and Mrs. Ruth from Charleston was there, and I was like, "Did you hear about these kids?" And she was like, "Yeah, they were my students." I was like, "Oh." Anyway, so who would have known? Right, so descent with modification, your book talks about this. Basically, what this says is that every organism has descended with changes from other species over time. Basically, that's what it is. And common descent is that basically all the organisms that exist on the planet today came from a common ancestor. Now, are we very closely related to like a bacterium? No, not at all. Okay, but way long ago, we had a common ancestor, like billions of years ago, literally. Darwin talked about descent with modification. Okay. We already talked about this. All right, so here's Lamarck. Doesn't happen. Darwin. giraffes actually, they didn't, their necks weren't long enough, they would just die. Yeah, okay. So what do we actually know now? A lot of the stuff, a lot has happened since Darwin's time, and we're going to talk about evidence for evolution probably in just a minute. But these are all different people that have, we've already talked about, but here's Mendel, here's Watson and Crick, and here is Thomas Hunt Morgan. So the idea of genetics and the inheritance of chromosomes. So he was talking about inherited traits or things like that, variations. Well, now variation is genetic variation. And it's contained on genes that are on your chromosomes and your DNA, or DNA and your chromosomes. So now using all the knowledge we know now, we can actually make a lot more sense out of it, if that makes sense. And a lot of evidence for evolution, scientists are using more and more the DNA record, basically. There's fossil DNA. There's fossils in your DNA right now, fossils. Okay, there's DNA that was a gene at one point, a functional gene, now no longer works. So a lot of times when they're looking at species and trying to figure out if they're closely related or not, they look at DNA sequences instead of just as more evidence, instead of just like fossil record or other stuff, homologies. I like this quote, nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution. This is the geneticist that was at Columbia University for a long time. And really, evolution is what we call the foundation that the house of biology is sort of built on. It's so important that everything else in biology is built up from it. It really is like the foundation of your house. It's so important and sort of sheds light on everything. So I've called this principle by which each variation, if useful, is preserved by the term natural selection. Like I said, it's written all weird if you read the book. But, so one more time, variation exists. A lot more offspring are born. There's a struggle for survival because of competition. The beneficial characteristics will be the ones that allow them to survive. We call them adaptations. And there you go. All right, we have like 5 PowerPoints for this chapter. So that was one. All right, let's move here first. Evidence of evolution via natural selection. Okay, so there are many sources of evidence, and you should be able to talk about a few of them in the form of like a short answer type situation. Just FYI. So what is some of the evidence? Let's talk about it. The fossil record is a big one. And we'll have slides on all these. And fossil record, and this isn't a slide on the fossil record, but you'll see things called transitional species we'll talk about in a minute. Anatomical record, basically looking at structures, homologous and vestigial structures. Talk about analogous structures and what are those. Looking at embryology and development between different species and how they compare. Molecular record, so DNA sequences. Artificial selection, which is human caused, natural selection. We're going to talk about all this. And there's even more. Biogeography is another one, and I think that's in your book. So let's talk about all these. All right. So the first one we'll talk about is the fossil record. First of all, what is a fossil? Fossils only form where? What? Can a fossil usually form in a desert? No. It needs to be water. So fossils generally form in sedimentary rock. Sedimentary rock is from sediment. Sediment is like stuff that falls to the bottom of some sort of body of water. So if something lives in a lake and it dies, it'll be covered with sediment eventually. And over millions and millions of years, that could change and form into a fossil. Okay. You can also find fossils, quote unquote fossils, in like ice, organisms that died and like the ice thaws and you have a purposely preserved organism. So it's sort of like a fossil, it's dead, but it's not the same fossil as the sedimentary rock fossil. Also, peat bogs, there's something called in a peat bog, there's like no oxygen and nothing really lives in there, and they pulled out like 1,000-year-old human cadavers kind of from peat bogs. Anyway, they're not exactly the fossils like this, but anyways, the traditional fossils are formed in sedimentary rock, and over time, you'll have new sediments fall over the old ones, creating a record over time, a really cool place to find species that have changed over time. Now, the fossil record by nature is incomplete because, one, have we discovered every fossil that actually exists on the planet? No way. And two, everywhere there is on the planet, fossils weren't able to form because, like I said, there had to be water. So, by nature, the fossil record is not complete. It's always being added to, and therefore ideas can change. But the fossils you find within layers have shown a succession over time in change of organisms. It's actually really cool. Yep. Sure. So generally the older fossils will be at the bottom and the younger fossils will be towards the top, obviously. So how do we know how old a rock is? Radioactive dating. So carbon dating is one. There's actually all kinds of dating, not just carbon. If you look into it, you don't need to know it for like the AP Bio exam. You would say something like radioactive dating. There's different types of dating, and I'll look it up really fast. But depending on what you're looking at, it will give you a different relative age time span and a different like accuracy within that time span. Let's see. Holy cow. There's all kinds. Radiometric dating. So no. Study.com. No. I want like a chart. So potassium, argon. So it says, I'm just giving you examples. You think of carbon dating because I think maybe that's what you learned in, when did you learn that? I don't know, 8th grade? But it's not just carbon. That point is like, carbon-14 is a method used for young, less than 50,000-year-old rocks. So if you want to go older than 50,000 years, you have to use a different element to look at. So over here, does it tell us? It doesn't say. Look at that. Radiometric dating has been used to determine the age of the Earth, the Moon, meteorites, fossils, early man, timing of glaciers, mineral deposits, blah, 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 blah. Anyways. Oh, here we go. So uranium-235 over time will decay into lead-207. 0.704 billion years is the half-life. So you have to use a particular equation, and you look at the ratio of the original element and the daughter, quote-unquote daughter. You look at the ratio, and that tells you, using the half-life, you have to use some equations that tells you the relative age of the rock you're looking at. Does that make sense? So if there's a lot more uranium-235 versus the lead, that means it's not as old as you think. But the half-life is 0.704. So if you have half uranium-235 and half lead, then that rock is probably 0.704 billion years old, half-life. Half-life is the amount of time it takes for half of it to decay into the daughter. Make sense? Okay, anyway. So notice all those different things. Lots. Okay. So not just carbon was really the point I was trying to say there. Here, this is like Jurassic Park. That was amber. Remember, you seen the original Jurassic Park? The mosquito or something that was in the amber. Anyway. Mr. DNA, where did you come from? Y'all remember that part? Jurassic Park came out when I was in middle school, and I remember I saw it in the movie theater like 10 times. And it was also the same time that Aladdin came out in the movie theater, and I also saw that in the movie theater 10 times. I was in 8th grade, so the whole thing. I was obsessed with those movies. Okay. So the fossil record shows us how today's organisms have descended from ancestral species. So here we have the modern day elephants. We have an African elephant and an Asian elephant. They're a little bit different. And the woolly mammoth is extinct, but here it is, and then here are all the different kinds. Notice we have present day at the top in this particular picture, and notice none of these other organisms, are they alive today? No, okay. See how their lines stop? Okay, they're not alive today. Anyways, the way down here, ancestor, doesn't really look so much like the ones with the big old ears and a long trunk. So can you imagine, would this just quote unquote turn into this over quote unquote overnight? No. You would expect to see changes over time, small, gradual life changes usually. And so you would expect to see what we call transitional species. Okay, transitional species, like, where's my other example of the horse? Okay, modern day horse is really big and likes to live in pastures, green fields, okay? Way long ago, ancestral horse was like a dog, size of a dog, and it lived in a forest, okay? So you can imagine size of a dog horse versus modern day horse, okay? They probably just didn't jump from one to the other over time. You would expect to see a slow change over evolutionary time into the modern day horse, and you do. You find what are called transitional species. All these black dots are showing the transitional species that have been found in the fossil record, showing slow changes over time into what we see now the modern day horse. Make sense?
How many of them have spots?
Huh?
How big do they have spots?
I don't know. I have no idea. So one of the ways they know, like, you might ask a question I could answer, like, how do you know if they're related to that horse? Like, how do you know that fossil they found, Hyrax, whatever, how do you know that's related to this guy? Like, how in the world, okay? How do they do that? Paleontologists use nowadays complicated computer software. When they find bones here, so for example, here are 2 bones found in this little guy. They're basically the same in this big old guy. They're just larger. But they use computer software to determine like widths and angles and all digits, like divots and all kinds of stuff, and say, is that really the same bone? Are they closely related? Like, does that make sense? Mm-hmm. That's what they use now. And they have to be really careful when they're finding. Have you ever seen videos of paleontologists like using brushes and like, they're really gentle with their fossil. I can't imagine I would go insane. I'd be like, I just wanted to happen. I don't have that much patience to dig out fossils like that. Anyways, all right, let's move on. Birds. Did you know that birds were evolved from reptiles? Did you know? You should know this. Yeah. Okay. So, birds are evolved from reptiles. Okay. Well, imagine a reptile and then imagine a bird. They're very different, right? Like the feathers and all that stuff. Where in the world are there transitional species? Interestingly enough, there is one called the Archaeopteryx. And it lived about 150 million years ago. That's an artist's rendition of what it probably looks like. Here's a fossil. You can see in the fossil where the feather type things would be here. Okay, but here's kind of what it would look like. Notice it still has teeth. It still has claws on here, like little finger type phalanges. But this is an important sign that actually helps to link reptiles and birds. And here is the Archaeopteryx sort of skull and the modern flying bird skull and where their brain would be located. This is maybe how it would fly. If that can work. That was an animation that doesn't work right now. So the Archaeopteryx is the earliest known flying bird. It was found in the late Jurassic period is when they think it existed. It has a lot of primitive characters that the dinosaurs shared. It has teeth, a long bony tail, and what are called pinnate feathers. But it had asymmetrical flight feathers on the wing and tail that the dinosaurs did not have. And the feather arrangement is more similar to modern day flying birds. So it suggests some degree of powered flight capacity. Okay. So a computed tomography scanning and three-dimensional reconstruction of the brain case of a London specimen of the Archaeopteryx. This is what this is from. Showed that it closely resembled modern birds in the sense of vision and expanded auditory and spatial sensory perception in the ear. Like I said, a computer person would have to tell you all that, yeah. I don't, yes, I've seen a fossil, like, they have this actual one from the Smithsonian, and I saw it there when I went a long time, like 2010 is when I went. But yeah, it was a little case, and it was probably this big, the fossil was. Not very big at all. It was little. I was so excited, so I was just like, wow. I was like, oh my God, look! Yeah, not excited. And it had an enlarged forebrain, anyway, which suggested it had enhanced somatosensory integration to help it fly, anyway. So you should know about the Archaeopteryx. One of the things that you should be able to do on your response is pull in examples. Okay, I remember when I took ecology and evolution in college, the first class I took, I was like, why do I need to know all these examples? You would give all these examples of all this stuff. And it's because when you have to write an essay, you should be able to pull from your wide base of knowledge to support what you're trying to say. Evolution occurs. Well, how do you know? What are some examples? You should be able to pull and be able to explain. So I give all this to be able to give you examples on the AP exam for response area to be able to talk about and discuss in your response to be found knowledgeable. Make sense? Okay. All right. So did you know all life evolved in water originally? Yes? So, and then life evolved in water, and then at some point, land colonization occurred. Okay? But then what's interesting is that whales, modern day whales, actually evolved from a land mammal. So some organisms actually went back to the water. Well, what the heck? It's lost. All right. So where in the world? So here is what they think is the evolutionary ancient whale. So how in the world would the modern day whale come from that guy? This guy looks like a leopard or something, or like a dog, a furry thing with 4 legs and a tail. And then we have our whale. Well, what the heck? You would expect there to be transitional species, and they've actually been found. And there they all are. Okay. So I'm going to stop for a minute, and I want you to think about, well, why? Why was something that lived on land eventually move back to water? Like, why? What pressure would cause it to do that?
Lack of rising sea level. Maybe like when the
Emergency.
Not so much that. They might just die. We made that contribute, but what would force it to go into the water? Food sources, right? So maybe there's a lot of competition on land for food. Maybe there was a lot of competition, or not so much competition in the water. Make sense? So you would think about what would drive an organism to want to go in the water, maybe to forage or get food sources. Okay. So in 2006, this little guy right here was discovered. This is called a pictolith, and a pictolith was really this missing link. Actually, no, I digress. Sorry, hold on, don't write it down. Hold on. This little guy, this is not the pictolith, was discovered. And notice this guy looked like a 4-legged walking animal. You see that? This is probably had kind of webbed feet, but it started to get something called a fusiform body shape. Fusiform is streamlined. A fusiform body shape is like a fish or a whale. Okay, they're streamlined. It reduces friction as something moves through the water. Okay. Anyway, so probably like what allowed the original, like early one of these guys to get in water? Maybe they could hold their breath longer. Maybe they were good swimmers. Okay, not all of them that went into the water probably survived, but some of them did. They were able to get food because of whatever natural variation allowed them to be in water for a longer period of time. they reproduced, and then they passed on their genes, and eventually over millions upon millions upon millions of years, we now have the modern day whale. Holy cow. So let me show you a video on that first. This one is called the Amphilocystic Nathan. Walking whale who likes to swim is what it stands for. This one was discovered in the Indus River Valley between India and Pakistan. Let me show you a video on this guy, and then we'll go to the cichlid. Sorry, cichlid something else. Did y'all watch these evolution videos in Bio 1? Do you remember them? Okay.
Yeah, because it's really bad.
Our children will never teach him that. That's just
Oh, did you see that on the news?
Yeah, we're so happy.
Yeah, but alright, literally shame to do a lot of that.
I thought they were waiting until Sharon died.
Yeah, they're waiting until all these whales die.
But I'm like, just kind of thinking, let them perform movies on the one whale.
No, they're finishing with these whales. They're not gonna have any more new whales.
So they're just gonna keep that thing.
No, I think they want more than
Fossils provide the most interesting evidence for evolution, and certainly the most powerful for most people.
Now, I want you to look behind them.
There's an abundance of hard evidence at the molecular, chemical, and anatomical level that evolution happens. But perhaps it's the clues hardened in stone that tell evolution's story most physically.
Here's the backbone. You can tell how big these vertebrae are. The history of life is all a record in fossils. Millions of them, from strata, layer by layer by layer back through time, are all interconnected. Now, partly this layering and succession is how we tell time in geology, but it's also the principal evidence that life has changed through time, that life has evolved through time, that the things living today can all be connected back through time to common ancestors.
These now lifeless dry rocks are gold to paleontologists. They are the puzzle pieces to the origin of one of the most powerful and majestic animals on Earth, the whale.
The evolution of whales has always been sort of a mystery. They're like us in that they're very intelligent. They're mammals. They're warm-blooded. They nurse young and feed them milk. But they're very, very different. I mean, they live in water. They can hear in water. And they swim around like fish. So the question is this. We know that mammals originally evolved on land. That whales live in the water. How did that shift, how did that evolution happen from life on land to life in the water?
That question consumes paleontologist Phil Gingrich. The evolution of whales has been his passion ever since 1978, when his team unearthed a rock in Pakistan that appeared to have a skull embedded in it.
When we found it, all you could see was the brain case. So I thought it was a wolf-like animal with a very small brain. When it was cleaned, the ears were uncovered, and I could see that it had a very characteristic whale ear, and that shows us that what we have is a whale, not a wolf, not a deer, not some other kind of mammal, but the fossil whale.
Gingrich named the whale's ancestor Pakicetus. With only its skull as evidence, scientists do not know for sure what the next Pakicetus looks like. But some scientists hypothesize that it resembles a modern seal. How do we know evolution happened?
Okay, look at this, Bill.
Paleontologists look for fossils that have transitional features from one way of life to another. They use these related forms to create a comprehensive picture of evolutionary change. When fossils of related species are located, scientists organize them by their physical similarities. Sometimes these similarities don't evolve all at once, like the whale ear of Pakicetus, which lacks many other whale-like features in its backbone and limbs.
Whales' bodies contain inside them connections or clues to their past. In their mammalian traits, they're signs of their recent history, but they're also signs of a very ancient history. Take their flippers. On the outside, their flippers look like fish fins, but on the inside, the bones of that flipper are very similar to those in a monkey's arm, in the wing of a bird, and in the limb of a frog.
Egypt today seems an unlikely place for Phil Gingrich to find intermediate whale fossils.
This is Wales Valley in Egypt. You can see behind me there are many hills of sandstone standing above shale. What's important, it's called Valley of Whales because there are about 400 skeletons of whales weathering out here. This was a wide open blue sea with a full range of sea life living in it. A lot of invertebrate shellfish, sharks, about 5 or 6 kinds of whales living here.
Gingrich searches for intermediates with hind limbs and feet to trace back until those feet and hind limbs are as big and fully functional as any 4-footed animal that lives on land.
It is a Basilosaurus. Look at this. Here's the skull, incisors up front, the rest of the teeth come back to here, and then the whole length of the skull is over 1 meter.
His find, Basilosaurus, had tiny hind legs with a mobile knee and several toes, and lived 35 to 41 million years ago. Here's where scientists place this transitional form on the fossil record. The discovery of another fossil has led scientists to conclude that whales evolved from a land mammal much like this one, called Synonyx. Perhaps its descendants found the water a source of abundant food and a haven from competition. Over millions of years, through variation and selection, front legs became thin, rear legs disappeared, bodies lost fur, and took on their familiar streamlined shape.
Whales show us the sheer creative power of evolution. I mean, from a wolf-like creature to a whale in 10 or so million years is amazing.
Each dig and discovery adds more stone, more bone, more hard evidence for evolution, for the origin of life, for its history here on Earth, and for the evolutionary relationships among all forms of life.
Okay. Okay. Now, the Pictolith is something else. The Pictolith was, so life evolved in water. The Pictolith is probably one of the earliest organisms to walk on 4 legs on land that still kind of lives in the water. So this was this link from sea to land animals. This little guy looks weird. It looks more like a fish, but it actually had flippers that were able to kind of prop itself up and kind of like walk on land, quote unquote walk. Anyway, so here's what the fossil looks like. So that's that little guy. Anyway, okay. The video talked a little bit about homologous structures. I'm not sure that he used that word in there, but homologous structures are ones that on the outside, so the wing of a bat, the flipper of a whale, the leg of a cat, and the arm of a human have very different functions. So we use our arms, our hands and stuff to pick up stuff or whatever. We don't walk on them. Cats obviously walk on their legs. Whales use their flippers to move around in the water, and bats obviously fly. So they have very different functions, but if you look at their internal structure, they're very similar in terms of their bone structure. We have the carpal bones, or what these little yellow things are called, attached to two other bones, the radius and ulna, and that this general structure is very similar. Why in the world we have very similar structures? Now think about a whale, okay? If you were going to design a whale on your own, would you put this bone structure in your whale fin? Oh, would you have all this? You'd probably put one long piece, right? Why would you put all those different pieces if they don't move around each other? You wouldn't, okay? The reason why this bone structure exists is because the whale descended from a four-legged walking land animal. And over time, the bones have changed in that whale to look more like this, but they still have the leftover bone structure. Anyway, so it suggests common ancestry. They're called homologous structures. Even though they might have very different structures on the outside, when you actually take a closer look inside, you'll see that homology. So don't confuse homologous structures with analogous structures. Hold on. Plants also have it too. We always think about animals. We kind of forget plants. But these are all like leaves, traditional leaves, needles, succulents, cacti needles, vines, tendrils, and the poinsettia, the red leaves, the colored leaves. They're all homologous structures. So if you look internally, their internal cell structure is very similar, suggesting they're relatively closely related. They're all modified forms of leaves as well. But don't get those confused with analogous structures. Analogous structures are like the wings of a dragonfly and the wings of a bird. They have the same function, okay? But if you actually look at them closely, they're not at all the same, okay? So analogous structures, even though organisms might have the same outside structure, doesn't suggest common ancestry. But what does it suggest? Why would something evolve life? Yeah, the environments they live in, some sort of selection pressure would, force them to evolve flight to get away from predators or to get more food or whatever. So maybe they've experienced similar selection pressures over time, but they're not closely related.
How do they explain flight?
Huh?
How do they explain flight?
What do you mean explain it?
Like, how do
Explain why it evolved?
they, like, how they know? Like, how does somebody just, like,
Well, right. It's complicated.
if they even have, what do they do? Is it just
Well, it's like in that Archaeopteryx, that was a sort of a weak, that organism they think actually could fly for short periods of time, but how would they know to jump up and try to fly? I don't know. Same thing with, I didn't put it in here, did I? Oh, well, I did on another slide. So flight evolved in 3 different groups. So in insects, in birds, and in mammals, flight has evolved, but doesn't suggest common ancestry. It just means that they've been experienced similar selection pressures. So getting away from predators, getting more food, whatever. Mm-hmm. It is. Right. But so convergent evolution is a term I haven't talked about yet. Convergent evolution is when you have similar like things happening, but in not closely related groups of organisms. So flight evolving in 3 different groups is an example of convergent evolution. Doesn't suggest common ancestry. Another example of convergent evolution is with fish, our aquatic vertebrates, and they have that almost finished fusiform body shape, okay, that reduces friction as you move through the water. And dolphins are aquatic mammals, okay, they breathe air and all that. They don't have gills, but they also have that fusiform body shape. So it's solving a similar problem with a similar solution, moving through life in the water. So they've adapted the same kind of body shape. All right. Get ready for the plant lab on Monday. We'll do more 22 on Monday, and your test is on Tuesday, so study.
Own the rest of the class, because I like this class.
My head is killing me. Do what?
Can we not just keep everyone out here? Just keep this class on?